The rain had already started falling when Daniel Hart noticed something strange. From the large glass window of his office, the billionaire watched the front gate of his mansion as the staff finished their evening duties. Most of them left together, laughing or talking on their phones as they walked down the long driveway. But one person always left quietly, almost like she didn't want anyone to notice her. Her name was Maria, the maid who had been working in Daniel's house for nearly a year. Maria was different from the other employees. She never complained, never asked for anything, and always kept her head down while working. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, and every night she left long after the rest of the staff had gone. At first, Daniel barely paid attention to her. After all, his world was filled with billion-dollar meetings, luxury events, and endless business decisions. But over time, something about Maria's routine started to bother him. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired someone gets from cleaning a large house all day. It was deeper than that. Some days her eyes looked red, as if she had been crying. Other days she seemed distracted, almost worried, but she never spoke about it. If anyone asked how she was doing, she simply smiled politely and said she was fine. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave for an important dinner meeting, he saw Maria rushing out through the gate. What caught his attention wasn't that she was leaving. It was the way she left. She looked around nervously before quickly getting into an old taxi waiting at the corner of the street. Something about it didn't feel right. At first, Daniel tried to ignore it. It wasn't his business where a maid went after work. But the next day, the same thing happened. And then the day after that, Maria would finish her work, quietly slip out of the mansion, and rush into a taxi that took her somewhere in the city. Curiosity slowly turned into concern. Daniel was a man who built his empire by paying attention to small details others ignored. That instinct was now whispering to him again. Why was Maria leaving in such a hurry every night? Why did she look so worried lately? And most importantly, where was she going? A few nights later, Daniel made a decision he never thought he would make. Instead of heading to his usual business meeting, he told his driver to keep a distance and follow the taxi Maria had just entered. The city lights blurred through the rain-covered windshield as the car quietly followed behind. The drive took nearly 30 minutes, leaving the wealthy neighborhoods far behind. Soon the streets became darker, quieter, and far less glamorous than the world Daniel was used to. Finally, the taxi stopped. Maria stepped out and quickly walked toward the entrance of an old hospital building. The lights inside were dim, and the place looked almost forgotten by the rest of the city. Daniel frowned. A maid secretly visiting a hospital every night? That didn't make sense. Curious and uneasy, he stepped out of the car and walked inside. The smell of disinfectant filled the air as nurses moved quietly through the hallway. Daniel followed the direction Maria had gone, his heart beating faster with every step. And then he reached the door of a small hospital room. The moment he looked inside, everything he thought he knew about Maria suddenly shattered. Daniel stood still in the quiet hospital hallway, his hand resting lightly on the half-open door. The dim light from inside the room spilled into the corridor, and for a moment he simply watched without making a sound. Maria was sitting beside a small hospital bed. Her back was slightly bent forward, her hands gently holding the hand of a young boy who looked no older than 8 or 9. Tubes and medical equipment surrounded the bed, and the slow beeping of a heart monitor filled the silence of the room. The boy's face looked pale, almost fragile, and his eyes were closed as if he had been sleeping for a long time. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. This was not what he expected to see. Maria leaned closer to the child and softly brushed his hair away from his forehead. There was a tenderness in her movements that Daniel had never noticed before. In the mansion, she always moved quickly and quietly, focused only on her work. But here, in this small hospital room, she looked completely different. Not like a maid, but like a mother trying to protect the most important person in her world. "I'm here, my love," she whispered gently. "Mama is here." Daniel froze. Mama. The word echoed in his mind. He had never heard Maria talk about family before. As far as Daniel knew, she lived alone in a small apartment on the other side of the city. The staff records simply said she had no listed relatives nearby. No one had ever mentioned the child. Yet here she was, sitting beside a hospital bed every night. A nurse quietly walked past Daniel in the hallway, pushing a small cart of medicine. She nodded politely at him, assuming he was another visitor. Daniel nodded back, still trying to process what he had just seen. Inside the room, Maria carefully adjusted the blanket around the boy. Her face looked exhausted, but there was also determination in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had been fighting a silent battle for a long time. Daniel stepped back slightly from the door, not wanting to disturb the moment, but questions began racing through his mind. Why had Maria kept this secret? And why was the boy here alone in a hospital that looked old and underfunded? Daniel glanced down the hallway again. The building didn't look like one of the expensive private hospitals that wealthy families usually used. The paint on the walls was slightly faded, and the lights flickered every now and then. It looked like a place people came to when they had no other options. Inside the room, Maria pulled a folded envelope from her purse. She opened it slowly and looked inside. Even from where Daniel stood, he could see it contained money. But the way she stared at it told a clear story. It wasn't enough. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength, then placed the envelope on the small table beside the bed. A quiet sigh escaped her lips before she gently squeezed the boy's hand again. At that moment, the boy stirred slightly. His eyes opened just a little, and he looked up at her weakly. "Mama, you came," he whispered. Maria forced a soft smile, even though tears quickly filled her eyes. "Of course I came," she said. "I will always come." Daniel felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest as he listened from the doorway. He had built companies worth billions. He owned houses in different countries. His life was surrounded by luxury and comfort. Yet in that small hospital room, he was witnessing something far more powerful than anything money could buy. The boy's breathing suddenly sounded strained, and one of the machines beside the bed began to beep a little faster. Maria quickly leaned forward, worry spreading across her face. Daniel instinctively took a step closer to the door, and just as a nurse hurried down the hallway toward the room, Daniel heard Maria say something that made his heart skip a beat. "Please stay strong," she whispered to the boy. "The doctor said we just need a little more time, just a little more." Daniel's eyes slowly moved toward the envelope of money on the table, and for the first time, he began to realize that Maria's secret might be far more painful than he ever imagined. Daniel stepped back in the door as the nurse quickly entered the room. He didn't want Maria to notice him there. Quietly, he moved down the hallway and stood near a window, trying to process everything he had just seen. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping against the glass while the city lights blurred through the darkness. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire felt completely out of place. He had spent most of his life solving problems with money and influence. If a company struggled, he invested. If a project failed, he rebuilt it. But the scene he had just witnessed inside that small hospital room felt different. It wasn't a business deal or a boardroom decision. It was something deeply personal, something painful that Maria had been carrying alone. A few minutes later, the nurse stepped out of the room and walked down the hallway. Daniel noticed the worried expression on her face. Without thinking too much, he slowly approached the reception desk nearby. "Excuse me," he said politely. The receptionist looked up from her computer. "Yes, sir?" Daniel hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to reveal too much, but curiosity was pushing him forward. "The boy in room 12, he said carefully, is he going to be okay?" The receptionist glanced toward the hallway and then lowered her voice slightly. "Are you family?" Daniel paused before answering. Friend." The woman sighed quietly, as if she had heard the same question many times before. "He's been here for several months," she explained. "His condition is serious. The doctors have been trying their best, but the treatment he needs is very expensive." Daniel felt that heavy feeling return to his chest. "And his mother?" he asked. The receptionist gave a small nod. "Maria. She comes every single night after work. Never misses a day. She sits with him for hours." Daniel looked down for a moment, remembering the envelope of money on the bedside table. "Is there no other family helping her?" he asked. The receptionist shook her head slowly. "As far as we know, she's alone." Those words echoed in Daniel's mind. Alone? For a moment, he imagined Maria waking up early every morning, working long hours cleaning a mansion that wasn't hers, smiling politely at people who barely notice her, and then spending every night in a hospital, hoping her son would survive. And she had never said a word. At that moment, a doctor walked past them, holding a medical chart. The receptionist quickly called out to him, "Dr. Harris, someone was asking about the patient in room 12. The doctor stopped and looked toward Daniel. His expression was calm but tired, the kind of look doctors develop after years of difficult cases. "You're here about the boy?" he asked. Daniel nodded slightly. The doctor glanced at the chart in his hands before speaking again. "His condition requires a specialized procedure. Without it, his chances become smaller over time." Daniel noticed the careful way the doctor chose his words. "And the mother?" Daniel asked quietly. Dr. Harris sighed. "She's doing everything she can. She's already paid for the treatments we've been able to provide so far. But the next step," he paused for a moment, "it's far beyond what most families can afford." Daniel felt the weight of those words settle over him. From down the hallway, he could hear Maria softly talking to her son again. Her voice was gentle, filled with encouragement, even though fear clearly hid beneath it. The doctor continued walking, leaving Daniel standing there in silence. For a long moment, the billionaire simply stared at the floor of the hospital lobby. His mind was filled with questions. Why had Maria never asked for help? Why had she chosen to carry this burden alone while working in a house owned by someone who could easily change everything? Inside the room, the boy laughed weakly at something Maria had said. The sound was small, but it carried through the quiet hallway. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the door again, and suddenly, another troubling thought crossed his mind. If Maria had been fighting this battle alone for months, how much time did the boy actually have left? Daniel remained in the hospital hallway for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds coming from Maria's room, the soft beeping of the machines, the distant footsteps of nurses, and Maria's gentle voice telling her son little stories filled the air. The scene kept replaying in his mind. Every detail felt heavier the more he thought about it. Finally, he stepped outside into the cold night air. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but his mind was far from calm. As his driver opened the car door, Daniel raised a hand. "Not yet," he said quietly. He stood there for a moment, staring back at the hospital building. It looked small and worn compared to the massive buildings he owned across the city. Yet inside those walls was a struggle far more real than any problem he had ever faced in a boardroom. During the drive back to his mansion, Daniel said almost nothing. The city lights passed by the window while his thoughts stayed fixed on Maria and her son. He remembered every moment he had ever seen her working in the house, quietly cleaning the floors, preparing rooms, or carrying heavy laundry baskets. She had always looked calm, polite, and invisible to most people. Now he realized she had been carrying something far bigger than anyone knew. The next morning, the mansion looked exactly the same as it always did. Staff members moved through the halls, doing their usual work. The kitchen buzzed with activity. Gardeners trimmed the trees outside. Everything appeared normal. But Daniel's attention was fixed on one person. Maria arrived early as usual. She greeted the other staff politely and immediately began cleaning the large living room. If anyone looked closely, they might have noticed exhaustion in her face, but she still worked carefully, making sure every corner of the house looked perfect. Daniel watched quietly from the balcony above. She hadn't noticed him yet. For the first time since she started working there, he realized how fragile she looked. Her movements were slower than before, as if the sleepless nights were slowly catching up with her. Later that afternoon, Daniel called his assistant into his office. "Find out everything you can about the hospital on Brookside Street," he said calmly. The assistant looked slightly confused but nodded. "Of course, sir." Within a few hours, a thin folder was placed on Daniel's desk. Inside were details about the hospital, its financial struggles, and the limited equipment it had for serious treatments. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly. Then he reached the section about the specialized procedure the boy needed. The number printed on the page made him pause. For someone like Daniel, the cost was not impossible. But for a maid working long hours just to survive, it might as well have been unreachable. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Now the question wasn't whether he could help. The question was why Maria had never said anything. That evening, just like every other night, Maria finished her duties and quietly walked toward the gate. Daniel was already waiting in his car a short distance away. Again, the same old taxi arrived. Again, she looked around quickly before getting inside. And once again, Daniel followed. When they reached the hospital, he stayed a little farther back this time, watching as Maria rushed inside with a small bag in her hands. Something about her movements felt more urgent tonight. Inside the hospital, the hallway looked more tense than before. Nurses moved quickly between rooms, and a doctor was speaking quietly with someone near the reception desk. Daniel walked closer, his heart beating faster, through the partially open door of room 12. He saw Maria standing beside the bed, but this time she wasn't telling stories. She was holding her son's hand tightly, and tears were running down her face. The machines beside the bed were beeping faster than before. Dr. Harris stood nearby, speaking gently but seriously to her. Daniel couldn't hear every word, but one sentence reached him clearly. "We may be running out of time." Maria shook her head immediately, her voice breaking as she spoke. "No, please. There must be something else we can do." Daniel felt a chill run through him as he stood frozen in the hallway. The tension in the room was growing by the second, and for the first time, the billionaire realized that whatever decision he made next might determine whether that little boy would get another chance at life. Daniel stood just outside the room, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. Maria was still holding her son's hand, her shoulders shaking as she tried to stay strong. Dr. Harris spoke gently, but the seriousness in his face was impossible to ignore. The machines continued their steady, urgent beeping, filling the small hospital room with tension. Daniel had already decided he couldn't simply walk away from this. He was about to step forward, ready to finally reveal himself and offer help when something unexpected happened. Two men in dark suits suddenly walked down the hallway. They weren't doctors or hospital staff. Their steps were firm and purposeful, and they carried the kind of quiet authority that made people move aside without asking questions. One of them held a tablet, while the other spoke quietly to the receptionist. Daniel slowed his movement and stayed near the corner, watching. The receptionist looked confused as the men showed her some documents. After a brief conversation, she nervously pointed toward Maria's room. Daniel felt a strange feeling of unease. The two men walked straight down the hallway and stopped in front of room 12. Without hesitation, one of them knocked lightly before opening the door. Inside the room, Maria turned quickly, wiping tears from her face. "Yes?" she asked, clearly surprised. The man with the tablet gave her a polite but distant look. "Maria Alvarez?" She nodded slowly. "We need to speak with you regarding the patient," the man said. Maria looked confused. "What about my son?" The second man stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. There had been some developments regarding his case. Daniel watched from the hallway, sensing the tension rising again. Maria stood up slowly. "What developments?" The man glanced at the medical machines beside the boy before answering. "The treatment your son requires. It involves specialized equipment that only a few medical facilities can provide." Maria nodded quickly. "Yes," the doctor told me. "I'm trying to arrange the money." The man exchanged a quick look with his colleague before speaking again. "It's not just about money." Maria frowned, clearly not understanding. "What do you mean?" The man tapped something on his tablet, and then looked directly at her. "This particular procedure requires access to a rare experimental program. The equipment, the specialists, everything involved is part of a private medical research initiative." Daniel felt his attention sharpen. "Experimental program?" Maria's voice grew tense. "But if it can save my son, then please tell me what I need to do." For a moment, the room became very quiet. Then the man gave a slow nod. "There's a possibility he could be accepted into the program," he said. "However, approval is extremely limited." Maria stepped closer, desperation clear in her voice. "Please, just tell me what they need. I will do anything." Daniel noticed the way the two men exchanged another glance before answering. The program sponsors occasionally select patients based on unique medical factors. The man explained carefully. Your son's condition happens to match certain criteria. Maria's eyes filled with hope for the first time. So he can receive the treatment? The man paused before responding. Possibly. Maria's hands trembled slightly. Then what's the problem? The second man finally spoke, his voice quieter but far more serious. The problem is, the program is privately funded. Maria didn't seem to understand. Funded by who? The man hesitated for a moment before answering. By the Heart Medical Foundation. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. The Heart name echoed loudly in his mind. It was his foundation. For a few seconds, the hallway seemed to spin around him as the truth settled in. The treatment that could save Maria's son was connected directly to a program funded by his own billion-dollar charity. Inside the room, Maria looked overwhelmed. But if the foundation is helping children, she said softly, then why hasn't anyone told me about this before? The man lowered the tablet slowly. Because admission to the program requires final approval from one person. Maria's voice barely came out as a whisper. Who? The man looked down at the screen again and read the name, Daniel Hart. Outside the door, Daniel stood frozen. Maria had no idea that the man she worked for every day, the billionaire who owned the mansion she cleaned, was the very person who could decide whether his son lived or lost his last chance. For a few seconds, Daniel could not move. Hearing his own name spoken inside, that small hospital room felt unreal. The Heart Medical Foundation had been created years ago after one of his biggest business successes. At the time, he had donated millions to medical research programs, trusting teams of specialists to run the projects. He rarely looked closely at the individual cases that came through the system. But now one of those cases was standing only a few feet away from him, and it was Maria's son. Inside the room, Maria looked confused and frightened. I don't understand, she said softly. I've never met this person. How could he decide something like this? The man with the tablet spoke calmly. The foundation was built by him, and certain experimental treatments require his final authorization. Maria glanced down at her son, who lay quietly in the hospital bed. The machines continued their steady rhythm beside him. So if this Daniel Hart says, yes, my son can receive the treatment? The man nodded. Yes, if he approves it. The procedure can begin immediately at one of the Foundation's partner hospitals. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. Then please, she said, her voice trembling, tell me how I can speak to him. I will do anything. I will work my whole life if I have to. That was the moment Daniel finally stepped forward. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. Maria turned around instantly, and when she saw who was standing there, her face went completely still. Mr. Hart? She said in disbelief. The two men in suits immediately straightened when they recognized him. Sir, one of them said respectfully, but Daniel barely noticed them. His eyes were focused on Maria and the boy lying in the bed. He walked slowly into the room. You don't need to search for Daniel Hart, he said quietly. I'm already here. Maria looked shocked, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to understand what was happening. You followed me? She asked. Daniel nodded gently. I did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt heavy with emotion. I'm sorry, Maria whispered. I never meant for you to see this. I didn't want to bring my problems into your home. Daniel shook his head slowly. You've been carrying this alone for months while working in my house every day, he said. You never asked for help. Not once. Maria looked down at the floor. You gave me a job when I needed one, she said quietly. I don't want to risk losing it. Daniel looked at the boy again. The child's small chest rose and fell slowly while the machine beside him continued to beep. What's his name? Daniel asked. Lucas, Maria replied. Daniel stepped closer to the bed and looked at the little boy's pale face. For a moment he didn't speak. Something in his expression softened in a way Maria had never seen before. Finally he turned back to the men in suits. Prepare everything, he said firmly. Lucas will be accepted into the program. Immediately. Maria gasped softly. Mr. Hart, are you serious? Daniel nodded. Yes. The foundation was created to help children exactly like him. Tears quickly filled Maria's eyes. She covered her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her. But just as the tension in the room began to ease, Dr. Harris stepped forward slowly. "There is something else you should know," the doctor said carefully. Daniel looked at him. "What is it?" The doctor hesitated before speaking. "The experimental procedure. It has only been attempted a few times before. The success rate is still uncertain." Maria's hopeful expression froze. "And without it?" Daniel asked quietly. Dr. Harris sighed. "Without it, Lucas has very little time." Silence filled the room again. Maria looked from the doctor to Daniel, her voice barely a whisper. "So this treatment is his only chance?" "Yes," the doctor said gently. Daniel looked down at Lucas once more. The boy suddenly opened his eyes slightly, as if sensing the people around him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Daniel felt something shift deep inside his chest. He turned back to the doctor with quiet determination. "Then we give him that chance." Maria began to cry again, but this time the tears carried hope. As the medical team started making urgent arrangements, Daniel remained beside the bed, watching Lucas carefully. And in that moment, the billionaire realized something unexpected. Following his maid to the hospital had not just changed the boy's future, it had changed his own life forever. Within the next hour, the quiet hospital hallway turned into a place of sudden movement. Nurses hurried in and out of the room, making calls and preparing documents. The men from the Heart Medical Foundation were already arranging Lucas's transfer to one of the Foundation's partner hospitals where the experimental treatment could be performed. What had felt like a hopeless night only moments earlier was now filled with cautious hope. Maria stood beside the bed, still trying to process everything that had just happened. She looked at Daniel several times, as if she still couldn't believe he was really there. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head gently. "You don't need to thank me. This is exactly why the Foundation exists." Maria looked down at her son again, carefully brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Every day I thought I might lose him before I could find a way to help him." Daniel understood that fear now. Standing in that room had made him realize how different life looked outside the world of wealth and business. Problems that seemed impossible for some people could be solved with a single decision from someone else. As the medical team prepared Lucas for transport, Dr. Harris approached Daniel. "We'll move him tonight," the doctor explained. "The specialist team is already waiting." Daniel nodded. "Whatever they need, make sure they have it." Maria listened carefully, holding Lucas's small hand as nurses adjusted the machines connected to him. Even though the situation was still serious, a quiet strength had returned to her voice. Lucas slowly opened his eyes again. His gaze moved around the room before stopping on his mother. "Mama," he whispered weakly. "I'm right here," Maria said softly. The boy noticed Daniel standing nearby and looked at him curiously. "Who's that?" he asked. Maria hesitated for a moment, then smiled through her tears. "He's someone who came to help us." Lucas gave a small, tired nod before closing his eyes again. An hour later, the ambulance from the partner hospital arrived. The medical team carefully transferred Lucas onto a mobile bed while Maria walked beside him, refusing to let go of his hand. Before they left, she turned back toward Daniel. "I promise I will never forget what you did tonight," she said. Daniel simply gave a small smile. "Just focus on Lucas," he replied. "That's what matters." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle drove away into the night, Daniel remained standing outside the hospital for a long moment. The rain had finally stopped, and the city streets were quiet again. The next few days were filled with updates from doctors and specialists. The experimental procedure was complex, and the entire medical team worked carefully to give Lucas the best possible chance. Maria stayed at the hospital the entire time, rarely leaving the waiting area. Daniel checked on the situation every day, sometimes visiting quietly without announcing himself. Then one afternoon, Dr. Harris called him. The procedure was successful, the doctor said. For the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to breathe easier. A week later, Lucas was sitting up in his hospital bed, weak but smiling. Maria stood beside him, her face filled with relief that words could barely describe. When Daniel visited that day, Lucas waved at him happily. "Hi," the boy said. Daniel smiled back. In the months that followed, Lucas slowly grew stronger. Maria continued working at the mansion, but her life was no longer filled with quiet fear. She often brought Lucas to visit the gardens on weekends, where he liked to run between the trees. For Daniel, the experience changed something deep inside him. He began paying closer attention to the work of the Heart Medical Foundation, making sure the programs truly reached families who needed them the most. Because sometimes the biggest discoveries in life don't happen in business meetings or luxury offices. Sometimes they happen in small hospital rooms, where a mother refuses to give up on her child, and where one unexpected decision can change everything.